So welcome to today's session. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Karen Mosley and I'm the Director of Professional Standards and Complaints with ACSL. And I'm very grateful to our presenter today and excited to have so many people here already with a few more to come in, hopefully. We're going to start today with a short prayer. Gracious God, provide us with a listening heart so we may see and hear the voice of children and adults at risk. May our organisations, authorities and families listen to, respect and do what is required to keep children and adults at risk safe. We ask you to help each of us to exercise our duties with compassion, integrity and clarity as we work together to enact real change and uphold the safety of all who come into contact with our church and communities. Amen. I also wanted to recognise that I'm facilitating this session from Bundjalung country and recognise the traditional custodians of the various lands of which you're all coming from today. We honour our First Nations people, culture and connection to land, sea and community, and we pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We also want to acknowledge the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families, the failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk, and the consequent breaches of community trust. So now moving on to the session, I'm pleased to introduce the Very Reverend Father Neil Muir, Rector for the Holy Spirit Seminary. Father Neil is a dedicated priest of the Diocese of Cairns with over 30 years of ordained ministry, having been ordained in 1994. I hope I've got that date right. Yep. He pursued postgraduate studies in Haythrop Jesuit College at the University of London to further his education from 2002 to 2004. Father Neil has served as a parish priest and has held the position of Episcopal Vicar. I hope I'm saying that right.
Episcopal. It sounds like a procedure.
Do you know what? In my head, I say it fine, and then I go to say it, and I'm like, this just does not roll off the tongue.
It's a strange title.
And the moderator of the Diocesan Curia in Cairns, contributing to the governance and administration of the diocese. In 2022, he was appointed as the Rector of the Holy Spirit Provincial Seminary, where he continues to foster the next generation of clergy. As I mentioned, we're happy for questions to come through as we go. Feel free to raise your hand or pop them in the chat if you'd prefer me to ask them for you. Otherwise, I'll hand over to you, Father Neil.
Thank you very much, Karen, and good morning, everyone. I've never done, I've done a webinar, but I've never been the presenter. So Karen's going to keep me under control with the team. Just a little bit more about myself. I was born in Cairns and grew up in a town called Atherton, which is within the World Heritage listed area of Australia. So I grew up in a beautiful place with rainforest, but also dairy farmers and maize and sugarcane and all that sort of stuff. My upbringing was a very privileged one. So in 1995, shortly after I was ordained, James Foley, the then Bishop of Cairns, sent me to the Torres Strait, where I had a profound experience of ministering there. And then some 20 years later, or a bit longer, I went back there on behalf of the bishop as part of a reconciliation program, which I thought was just mainly to represent him, and it was a ceremonial thing. But I was profoundly affected during that because part of the ceremony was the retelling of the abuse that the people in the Torres Strait had suffered, particularly under the church. And I was confronted by a little lady who was in her 90s, an auntie, who basically told me that I had been an abuser. Not myself personally, but because of the church I was representing. And from that moment on, I had a change of heart in terms of safeguarding its, not just its importance, but its centrality. It's part of the core of the church, and that's what I'll I want to emphasise today. I put down some points in terms of, mainly in terms of what we do here in the seminary with the young men who come in to be formed as priests, and how we engender and integrate into the program a sense of safeguarding and well-being, and in terms of the church's mission. But I want to open with a question to all of you. Don't have to answer it now, but just something to get our minds into it. And it's a simple question, but I think it's a very important one that sometimes just goes into the background. It certainly has with me from time to time. What steps have you taken in your community that you see as being vital in order to embed and bring to awareness an active safeguarding culture and attitude? When I was preparing for this presentation, I thought about theological and scriptural perspectives. And one was Genesis and creation, and how we are all created in the image of God and to be the image of God to each other, to be the beloved of God and to live that belovedness towards each other. And I think that's very important in terms of safeguarding and protecting the vulnerable, and also as a church being an advocate for them, which we have obviously in the past failed to do. The second scriptural passage that I reflect upon, and I reflect upon it quite often with regards to this area, was the Good Samaritan. How the one who was not accepted by the conventional religious leaders was the one who broke through cultural and religious barriers to care for and safeguard the man who had been attacked, abused, and abandoned. So they're sort of the perspectives that I've reflected upon as I put together this talk this morning. But I wanted to be a conversation, obviously. I said to Karen, it may not go for 30 or 40 minutes. It may go, but I'm going to work through some points that I've thought about in terms of my own context here at the seminary. There are issues that I've experienced here that affect the whole attitude and the place of safeguarding. And it might be handy if I share with you where our students come from, the cross-section they come from. At the moment, we have students who were born in Samoa, Canada, Vietnam, Poland, Nigeria. And that is fairly common to most seminaries throughout Australia, I imagine. There is an Indian man, but he comes from the French part of India, which was originally colonised by the French, Pondicherry. We have people from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds. Professionally, we have engineers, a barista, a coffee maker, parachute workers, a nurse, and someone who is in the Australian Defence Force. Blood collectors. We have two men who used to take blood samples. So there's different cultures, different backgrounds, different perspectives on life. And one of the challenges is to understand how some of the different cultural backgrounds sometimes don't acknowledge or understand quite where the Australian Church is coming out of, particularly in terms of the Royal Commission and the Church's reaction to it, and the policies and requirements that we now have as a church that we've now got in place. So at the beginning of every year, we have a mandatory safeguarding and professional standards session with men, which goes over a whole day. and they work through the national response protocols and the national response frameworks. But it's more than that. It's trying to bring to light for some of those men how this goes beyond just policies. And it has to go into what we're on about as a church and our mission, and who they are as disciples of Jesus, as men who are trained to be servant leaders of the church. So I use this little parable, if you want to use it, and some of you probably have seen it or heard it. It's about who has the greater interest if you sit down to a breakfast of bacon and eggs. Well, the answer is the chicken is interested, but the pig is totally committed. Now, I know that's got a funny aspect but when you delve into it, that's the difference between being interested in safeguarding and committed. We give our whole self, our whole life, not like a pig, but we give our whole self to the commitment of safeguarding. It should be really a part of our DNA. Karen, do you want to pause there for questions or keep going?
There's nothing jumping up yet, unless anybody had any thoughts they wanted to.
No offence to the pig. But it is part of our DNA as a Christian people. But when I was first involved in diocesan administration in Cairns, and we were working not just with clergy, but with the laity in terms of our requirements, and there was a huge resistance. Don't you trust us? I've been doing this for so many years, I've never had to do any of this. Are you saying that I'm a pedophile? There was a huge reaction, and that's not what we say to people in the church or here who are preparing to be leaders. We're saying, let's show our total commitment by the way we work towards and participate in the safeguarding ministry of the church. So one of the things we try to emphasize here is that it's part of our DNA as a Christian people, as a people of the gospel, as human beings, to care for one another, and in particular, to have compassion for those who are at risk, those who are vulnerable, and in particular, those who have been victims and abused. Because for quite some time, they were voices in the wilderness, and sometimes the church tragically, sinfully put them in the wilderness because it protected itself as an institution and forgot or ignored or didn't want to enter into its role as advocates for those who have been forgotten. So that's one of the things we try and push very, very much here in this seminary, and we try and integrate it through all the courses that are taught. I teach a course at the beginning of the propedeutic year called Formation. It briefs them on what the formation program is about. Pastoris Dava Vobis is the document from St. John Paul II that we refer to, and which our ratio is also based on, which is about to be renewed in light of the synod on synodality. We push that very much, that our safeguarding, our advocacy for those who are the underdog, the one who has been forgotten, the one who's been a victim, we push that very much. And in previous years, we have tried to bring in people to talk to the seminarians who have been victims, have been abused, as well as those who work in those areas. It's part of what it means to be a Catholic. It's not about the church being put down, but it's about the church acknowledging the past and how the church must, in light of that, get back to its roots universally, in terms of it becoming a holistic expression of the faith. As I said before, it's a total commitment which involves a constant awareness, an ongoing conversion, in terms of also how we look at how our systems evolve and how at the grassroots, and if they're going to be local pastors, how they introduce them and engage their community in living those systems, those policies wholeheartedly as part of their mission. The need to be accountable and transparent. One of the big things that we try and emphasise, and that should be emphasised across every seminary, is that to be called to ordained ministry, to be a seminarian, is not a life of entitlement. Now that can be a big battle at sometimes. Look at me, I am celibate. I've given up being the word, this to be this, and you know, I surely I'm entitled to something. Try to say, well, no, celibacy is not about entitlement. Celibacy is about being a gift in a particular way, just as being married is, or single, or a religious, or whatever. It's about living your baptismal call. So we have a big emphasis on baptismal calls. Now, in the background of all this, which Hans Zollner and others have warned about and spoken about, is the influence of certain websites, particularly on young men and on clergy too, in terms of very right-wing attitudes towards being at church. They are dangerous. And I no need to emphasise that how dangerous they can be. And so you can get what they call a submarine seminarian that goes through the hoops but really doesn't buy what we're on about. Now, I haven't encountered that problem in my time here as rector with anyone that's come in, but I've seen it in others, in people that have perhaps gone through previously. That can be dangerous in terms of safeguarding, I think. Healthy attitudes towards psychosexual understanding in the seminary, not to be afraid to name things and how that they may affect safeguarding, not to be naive. I think that's important, very important. Also explaining to students, and this is fairly important, I think, and it's come out of the Royal Commission, the difference between being secretive and confidential. There are appropriate times in ministry in every life when confidentiality is important. But secrecy leads to further secrecy and living in the shadows. Having secrets often are cover-ups. They lack transparency, honesty, integrity, and also could be preventing action being taken in terms of safeguarding professional standards, which are appropriate. Now, as rector, I've only ever encountered two areas of that, and that they were early interventions. But certainly that whole idea of being secret and doing things secretly to cover up and protect the institutional self, I think has to be watched and is certainly discouraged here in the seminary. Confidentiality, yes, that's appropriate to certain aspects of pastoral ministry, And of course, the seal of the confession is another matter, but confidentiality also has a limit if it involves something that is illegal, particularly in the area of safeguarding and professional standards. I spoke earlier about avoiding a sense of naivety, which sometimes I can come through with a very simplistic piety, or a very old-fashioned, what we call old-fashioned or traditional piety, which also can mean the person can be naive or prudish. If they're going to be ordained, like us all, they have to live in the real world, and have to be aware what's in the world and what's happening in the world. They also have to be aware of people who might interact with them, and they might think that it's harmless, but may be trying to make their way in to their lives or into their ministry to exploit a situation. I have experienced that recently. So you have to be constantly aware of, to be quite blunt, of people who have broken the law and have who are a threat to safeguarding, particularly of minors and vulnerable adults who may try and exploit their relationship with you as a minister. That's really been brought home to me this year. We had an experience of that where thank God, we cottoned onto it early and made the young man, the seminarian, aware of it, and he immediately took steps to act appropriately in terms of his relationship with that person, but he was being exploited. How to interpret the behaviours of people, and how to also be aware of your own behaviour. You might act towards someone in an innocent way, but they might interpret it in another way or want to. So that's very much made apparent to seminarians. I think that's an important part of preparing a man for ministry. How to interact with males and how to interact with females, to be aware of that interaction, the dynamics of that. The way in which we operate as ministers within the church, or how we prepare these young men to be ministers in the church, to instill a commitment to both a synodal structure and a servant leadership structure, or as Pope Francis emphasised at one stage, having an upside-down pyramid hierarchy, whereby the clergy, the Pope, serve the rest of the church, not dominate the church from a top-down, but rather from a bottom-up service model, which is very much part of the documents of Vatican II and subsequent documents on the church. The need for the new generation of clergy to be aware and formed in light of the Royal Commission, lest we forget, to not think that those issues are over, to not let down our guard, to not think, oh, well, we can just go back to normal, whatever normal was. Normal is protecting those who are vulnerable, those who are at risk, and to be vigilant about that. So some of the young men coming in aren't even or haven't been aware of the ramifications of the Royal Commission. That's not unusual for this generation. So to retell the story and the church's part in that story, not to cover it up, and then to emphasise why our policies and documents and procedures are very important in terms of how we are a missionary church. One of the things that interests me is that the generation of seminarians coming into the seminary are very much mission orientated. Now, they might be what we call conservative, although that's changing a little bit, I noticed this year. But they are very mission orientated. But for them to realise that the mission of the church involves this aspect of safeguarding, this aspect of being an advocate for the vulnerable in particular, and not forgetting them. And also to keep putting before young men our documents, our policies and how they evolve, keep them up to date, so that they don't collect dust on the shelf for them, but they're relevant. They're as relevant as the other church documents that we go through and analyse and teach. So to make it very much integrated into the program of the seminary. So if I can end off my reflection and my thoughts with a quote from the documents, the National Response Protocol from Pope Francis, when he considers the way forward. And I think it's very much important for all of us, but in terms of men here at the seminary who are being formed, I think this has to be re-emphasised to them. The Pope says, Pope Francis, looking back to the past, no effort to beg pardon and to seek to repair the harm done will ever be sufficient. Looking ahead to the future, no effort must be spared to create a culture able to prevent such situations from happening, but also to prevent the possibility of their being covered up and perpetuated. The pain of the victims and their families is also our pain, and so it's urgent that we once more reaffirm our commitment to ensure the protection of minors and of vulnerable adults. And if I can add to what the Pope says, add to each other. I think that's also part of safeguarding. So Karen, that's it from me, or maybe not, but I'll hand over to you to facilitate the questions.
Thank you. We haven't had any jump up just yet, but I had one. I mean, I really appreciate what you were talking about in relation to the difference between confidentiality and secrecy. I think that's something that comes up a lot, in that there is obviously things that need to be kept confidential and there are privacy laws, but it doesn't mean that we need to be secret. But one of the questions that popped up as you were talking, particularly in that last section, is one of the things that I've found, doing audits, working through the complaints process, is that safeguarding fatigue is a real thing. We're bombarded with it all the time. So how can you prepare people through the seminary for what that is in reality?
That's very good. Very good. And I don't say that in a patronising way. By continuously re-emphasising. So this morning they're doing their part of their course, 1.5-hour lecture on spirituality. And I know that Father Paul Chandler, the spiritual director, as well as the other formator that's involved in that, Father Matthew Maloney, who was part of the Ministry to Priests national program, will at some stage during that, because I've seen it written up in their course outlines, emphasise the spirituality of safeguarding. Okay, that you can't isolate every aspect. I think that's the problem. If we push safeguarding as a compliance, which it is, but not as a natural occurrence of being people of the gospel, then we will have fatigue, and we do have fatigue, because it's just looked on as another form or another thing to read.
Yeah.
Okay? but you can get fatigue in terms of other aspects of church too. You know, forgetting the theology of synodality, all that sort of thing, because we can tend to do things to death. I've heard from people, but they're part of who we are, our DNA. Like synodality is not just something new. Safeguarding shouldn't be something that we've just discovered.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
No, I think that's great. I mean, in essence, it's about embedding it within the culture rather than the compliance, the culture of the church. So we have had 2 questions come through. The first one says, how is the content of seminary training developed? Some seminarians have asked for assistance with basic communication skills. And then they said there's so much to cover.
Yeah. Well, there's a universal ratio, which is about to be recast in light of the synod for synodality to make it more involving of lay input. And then there's a national one developed, which was just being developed and is about to be approved, or has been approved by Rome and or noted by Rome and signed off on by the Catholic Conference, Bishops' Conference. But they're about to be revisited in light of the synod. But that's our basic documents. Pastoris Dapa Vobis from John Paul II, St. John Paul II, recast the whole, if you want to describe it as the whole curriculum or requirements for seminary formation into 4 pillars: intellectual, pastoral, spiritual, and human. But the first 3 should feed into the human being. How does it inform and help the human being develop and evolve? So seminary curriculums and programs are based on those 4 pillars. Okay, and in addition to that, they're also meant to be relevant to the context that the seminary or the churches that the seminary serve. So for Holy Spirit Seminary here at Banyo, it's the 5 dioceses of Queensland plus the Archdiocese of Adelaide. So part of that is myself and another staff member visit each of those dioceses to get the bishop's perspective. But the Queensland bishops also have set certain requirements they have for students. We're constantly re-looking at how we involve students in pastoral activities, how we send them out to their various local churches or parishes at the end of the year, and how we've just restructured our pastoral placement program. They go out for a year and 5th year here at the seminary. How does that get them in touch with the needs of the church, of the people they'll serve? And how do we give the people they'll serve a greater input into feedback into what the individual needs to do, or how they see the individual being formed? That's part of it. That's a challenge though, but that's part of it.
Yeah.
Does that
so we've got,
I hope it does.
We've got a few more. The next one is, how is establishing a clear understanding of accountability, authority, and leadership expectations of clergy best done? They've said the good work of voluntary parish safeguarding teams is significantly more difficult when clergy are resistant. Exactly,
I agree with it totally. Or when they don't see it as relevant, or they see it as an imposition. Well, if you've got resistance and it's not going to change, it's pretty hard to overcome. I suppose it goes back onto the bishop and the person in the diocese that is responsible for that. That's why it's so important to emphasise it here in their formation, to form them in that here before they're ordained, before they go out to serve. But yeah, there's no easy answer to that, because you're overcoming also a mindset, perhaps that the clergy are superior or shouldn't be challenged. And the church has emphasised that over certain, over history.
Yeah. So the next one, it looks more like a comment than a question, but I'll read it out anyway. The seminary's teachings need to be backed up in the parishes. For example, when seminarians are on placement, each interaction with people, families, vulnerable persons is an opportunity for reflection. One seminary visiting a home with the parish priest instantly responded to a request from a child to go with the child to look at some toy. The parish priest didn't make a scene, but immediately after the visit, the reflection involved considering the breach by allowing himself to be alone with the child. The lost opportunity to witness to our protocols by asking the mum to join him on the visit to the child's toys, etc., and what to do in similar situations in the future. So a good example, I think, of what you're talking about.
That's a very good example. Yeah, and that's that naivety and lack of awareness. And I'll give you a personal example. I visit family. I visit family in England, and on one occasion, I arrive at my cousin's home, and she said, "And you'll be sharing a room with little Jimmy tonight." Little Jimmy's 5 years old. I said, "No, I can't." I said, "I'll have to go and stay somewhere else." But see how we've got to be aware of that. Yeah.
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 And that's a hard one as well, because there's a naivety of everyone involved, I think, at times.
Yep.
So the next one, again, it's not so much a direct question, but it's asking for any comments if you have them. For some of us in parishes, the reality of clergy grooming a community and then acting out with vulnerable adults is also a reality that some are dealing with, and the ripples of abuse that it affects. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, that's where the community has to name that and take the appropriate action. And I think the other thing I meant to say, you can't put it off. You can't give anyone the benefit of the doubt. You have to confront it straight away.
Yeah.
Name the behaviour. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know someone who was an authority that was aware of a person who had been charged with child abuse crimes, and was aware of that person had come into the community and put it off until the bishop was coming back, which was a month away. That's not what you do. You use your own authority and you confront the person and work through that way to protect the wider community and the vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's quite a few coming in now. This one says, thank you, Father, for your presentation. It was so good. I've been reflecting on safeguarding across different cultures. In a seminary context where there are so many cultures represented, how do students get the chance to express what safeguarding looks like in their own context before we introduce them to the policies and regulations of living here in Australia?
Okay. It's a little bit hard for me to answer that one on practical experience, because most of our students have already come here and grown up in Australia. But for certain cultures or certain people from certain countries, they only see it as a problem here. This hasn't happened where we come from. Well, it probably has happened. Well, it has happened where they come from, but it's probably been hidden or dismissed the same way it happened here. So I think the telling of the story of victims from the past, and even getting them to come and, if they're willing, and we have had a couple of brave people come and talk to our guys, is very important. Also to to make them very much aware that this is required of them if they're to continue in the program.
Mm.
It's an accountability question. This is who we are. This is what we have to be attuned to. This is our culture. This is part of our mission. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, the next question says, do you have a systemic approach for identifying candidates who may be developing that sense of entitlement and or that idea of secrecy?
In a seminary, in this seminary, each year level has a formator assigned to them, and they meet regularly, at least once a month, with people, with the people in their group, and they provide them with feedback, not just from themselves, but from other formators. We also encourage their peers to feedback their behaviour to them. Okay, so we do have a systemic approach, and then we have a formal evaluation where those things are raised. But it's more the one-to-one on a monthly basis, where the formator, not just their own perceptions, but the perceptions of the formators, what they might pick up. It's not a spy network. And that's another thing we have to get over in Australia, is the dobber. We're anti-dobbers. Well, no, it's not about dobbing. It's about acting responsibly. So yes, we do. It's feedback, but it's also encouraging self-reflection and that's the other important aspect, I think, of a seminary formation program, and how those pillars feed into the human being formation, is self-awareness. So we just don't do a one-off assessment psychologically so they can get into the place where we look for flaws, and that's not foolproof. We also have things like the Myers-Briggs and other psychometric testing, which is given to the candidate for their purposes, so that they become aware of their weaknesses and their strengths. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do I react like this when I'm confronted with this, or why do I do that? Those sort of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So the next question is, I'm interested in the influence of extreme right-wing online content on young people, particularly young boys and men and clergy. Some of the content mirrors church teachings or uses similar messaging on male authority and masculinity. How does the church effectively disrupt and provide healthy and safe alternatives to this content and messaging?
Okay. Look, that's a hard,
a big question.
Because you don't know we don't tap. We have protocols around internet access and all that sort of thing, Wi-Fi within the seminary, but this is the big thing. You can't monitor what people are doing. You can see where, and it's not just not one seminary. It's almost a national or an international wave. So 2 years ago, this is just an example. In the old rite of ordination, the priest's hands were bound with a cloth originally to absorb the oil, and the priest. There was a tradition, you gave that to your mother, and I forget what it's called. It was called a special thing. 2 years ago, it re-emerged that guys would save the cloth that was used to soak up the chrism at their ordination. And then I was at 2 Thanksgiving masses, and it was presented to their mother in a wooden box. And when you die and you go to St. Peter and say, I was privileged to be able to give my son to the priesthood. Now, privileged, it just reinforces that idea that they're entitled, but they're also special. How do we counter that? Just talk. You just have to continually say, look, that's not a relevant way that the church thinks anymore, if it ever was. It's hard though, Karen, because you're sort of a bit behind the eight ball in terms of how knowing and having access. We check it ourselves. There was a website coming out of America, very right wing, that was basically instructing seminarians or those in formation how to stay under the radar, how not to be get into trouble with formators, that sort of garbage.
Yeah.
Formation's about the person discovering who they are, discerning their call, and part of that is a synodality thing, is that they get feedback from others, from members of the church, because it's not about their deciding to be a priest, it's about the church discerning whether or not they're suitable or called to that ministry. But to answer that, if someone has an answer to that, please let me know, because it is hard.
Yeah. So
not as prevalent, I noticed this year. It's sort of, there's a different, in this seminary took in 9 guys this year, and they're not so much into that, I don't think.
Yeah. So the next question is probably a little bit easier to answer, but equally as important. Can you talk a little bit about the place of professional supervision?
Yes. Okay. If there's an area we probably need to look at in seminary formation or here, is that they get supervision from their formators, which is in the external forum. Okay. Which means it can be used to feed back to them in terms of their suitability and discern their call and all that sort of thing. And that occurs mainly between them and their particular formator. And then they also have a spiritual director, and that's in the internal forum, and the spiritual director does not share any of that with me or any other formator. I can't hear confessions of students for that reason, nor can the bishop, nor can formators. But I think, just as I have professional supervision, which is extremely important, I've found since I started doing it 10 years ago, and I do it with a psychologist, a properly qualified person, I think that should be introduced into the seminary also. We do it in a particular way up to a certain year level. So propedeutic and second years have an opportunity. We have a counsellor on staff, a psychologist, who meets with them one-on-one, and then also does group work with them. But I'd like to see more one-on-one supervision, like priests and deacons are required to do.
Yeah.
That kind of that.
Yeah, that kind of links into the next question, which is that there's supposed to be, under the safeguarding standards, compulsory professional development and performance appraisals for all clergy, as well as professional supervision. And they've said this has been poorly implemented or not at all. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do, yes. I think as the rector of the seminary, I have to have a review, a 360. And then I have a big review in terms of, very similar to what a school principal might have in terms of the seminary itself. And I think it's essential for your own professional development to know where you're going, to know what your weaknesses are, to know how the other people working with you experience you in your particular role. But very few clergy, bishops, priests, deacons are all supposed to do it. I would be interested in how many are doing it, and I'm not in a position to gauge that but I think it's essential.
Yeah.
And very much so. And I know there's a couple of people in the audience that are involved in this area, very much so for parish priests, because they can become, or run the risk of becoming, little either conscious or subconscious dictators. just follow their program, but not anyone else's. That's not synodality. That's not church. So yeah, I think it's vital, and I don't think it's been taken up at all the way it should be.
Yeah.
There is an instrument, of course, put out by the I think it's the ACMRA. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there's some people who have really embraced that professional supervision and the performance reviews and appraisals, and some where I think they're still working towards that.
I think so, but I don't look. There was resistance from clergy. I'm speaking from my own experiences. When I was in my own diocese, there was resistance. It wasn't taken up.
So one final, which is more of a comment. Oh, hang on, no, we've had an extra question on performance appraisals. Who would conduct the performance appraisals for clergy?
Well, I think it needs to be someone external to that parish or that organisation, and it should be professionally done. So who should do it? Oh, I don't know. Someone who fits into that. Maybe the bishop appoints someone for parish priests and clergy, and maybe the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference appoints someone for bishops and dioceses. Yeah, that's a hard one to answer because it's much more complex, I think.
Yeah. Well, the last comment that I kind of have on there is someone said, regardless of vocation, we're all challenged in the same call to holiness.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And we all, if we're in the church, we all have a common baptism. That's the thing, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay, well, I think that kind of brings it up to the end, and I just wanted to say thank you to you for today's session. I think it's been a really good discussion. I think we've had some good questions coming through. So thank you again. But yeah, thank you very much for today, and hope everyone has a good day and a good weekend.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Particularly thanks to my friends from North Queensland, I can see. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thanks.